Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker, chills, death slayers, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm a useful idiot, and boy, I'm really fired up today. I'm doing some broad topics, and this one will be another one. And basic theme, as outlined in the title, is that all American presidents are warmongers and are responsible for the deaths of millions globally. And for the purposes of this video, I'm going to focus primarily on the 20th century. In fact, almost all in the 20th century. But I don't want to discount the fact that American presidents stretching back through history, um, American history, have all been involved in being warmongers and are responsible for the deaths of millions. And of course, some of our greatest icons, like Abraham Lincoln, of course, was essential in instigating the Civil War, which resulted in tens of thousands, hundred thousands of deaths. And to argue about the merits of that war would take another whole video, and I don't want to get into that. But I just want to point out that one could easily do another whole video right off the bat about presidents in the 19th century, and that includes the Mexican War, where we stole a huge chunk of land from Mexico, um, the Civil War, and the like, the War of 1812. I mean, there's just, since America was born, we've had a lot of wars, and that doesn't include the extermination and genocide of the Native American populations here. So this is nothing new, but we're going to go through the 20th century history of American presidents. And one thing I need to immediately point out, because I always do, this is no left-right thing. I went through a whole list of these presidents, and the area I'm covering, there's 10 Democrats and 9 Republicans, so pretty evenly split. So whichever side of the false left-right paradigm you gravitate towards, or want to point the finger at the other side and say, oh, they're the ones that are warmongers, it's pretty equally split. Both Democrat and Republican administrations, they love war. And they love war because they're serving their corporate masters. They're serving the very lucrative business of providing arms all over the world, and these wars, which generate a lot of wealth for the elites. Another topic that I covered recently. So it's not about spreading democracy around the world. It's not about saving democracy or protecting democracy in other countries. It's all about money, because everything is about money. And all these wars are about money. It's about territorial gain. It's about resources. It's about money. It's about shifting wealth to the top elites. The mother of the Rothschild sons, who set up all the central banks around the world, said that if her sons didn't want war, there wouldn't be any. So that shows that the elites and the banks, they make a lot of money off these wars. And there's a great video out there called "All Wars Are Banker Wars," and that's the absolute truth. The banks in most wars, they invest and make money off of both sides. They arm both sides. During World War II, while all the peasant armies of the United States and every other country in the globe were out there dying in the mud, dying in trenches, dying in beaches, the elites were making money. All during World War II, while all that was going on with U.S. boys, very often teenagers, these corporations in the United States, the biggest corporations in the United States, the biggest corporations that are still around now, were selling arms and supporting the militaries of Nazi Germany and Mussolini's Italy, while we're sending troops over there to fight them. And of course, part of that is just this generation of military equipment that costs millions. Everybody has to pay millions and billions for all this equipment, and it goes out there and it gets destroyed. So then another windfall profit is rebuilding all of this material and then continuing to sell it to anybody that wants them. Another good example of that is the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. And we supported both sides. We supplied arms to both sides while they just slaughtered each other. And that kind of foreign policy carries into the results we see in the world today. But anyway, let me go down this list. So we have President McKinley, a Republican from 1899 to 1901, and he was involved in the Spanish-American War and the aftermath, where the U.S. went into the Philippines. First we were greeted as liberators, and then we occupied the country and fought an insurgency for almost a decade. And of course, all the elites in the United States made money off of that. Then we have a Republican, Teddy Roosevelt, president from 1901 to 1909. And I have a lot of respect for Teddy Roosevelt. He's a very complicated character. His personal life is amazing. And but I don't have any illusions about the fact that he's the father of modern American imperialism. He's the one that made American presidents felt all over the globe, and he's responsible for planting the seed that's grown into the global American empire that we have now. And of course, he was involved in the Spanish-American War and the occupation of the Philippines as well. Then in 1909 and 1913, we had President Taft, a Republican, and he was the one that was involved in sending troops down to Latin America to protect corporate interests. That's all very well documented, and I'll be addressing that in the future. Then we had President Harding from 1921 to 1923. Oh, wow, I don't have any information about him, but the 1921 to 23 period, once again, is when we had U.S. troops involved in Latin America protecting corporate interests. And then we had President Coolidge from 1923 to 1929. And he's one of the more interesting characters. There weren't any wars under Coolidge per se, and one of the more fascinating things, I think I'll probably end up doing a whole video on Coolidge because his administration was really interesting, 6 years. And I know a lot of Americans don't even know about Coolidge, but from everything I've read and know, he could be one of the greatest presidents in American history. He was not well versed or interested in world affairs, and he was interested in expanding commercial exchange with all the countries in the world. Very reminiscent of the policies of Republican Ron Paul, who ran for president some years back. But the whole idea of generating wealth and raising living standards of people all over the world by commercial exchange on a global scale. And he rejected alliances, he rejected interventions in other countries, and he rejected the League of Nations because he knew, like the United Nations today, it would be ineffective in actually addressing these issues, even though it was designed to do that. And one of the really big spots in the Coolidge industry was the passing of the Kellogg-Briand Act, generated by America and France. And it renounced war as a means of solving conflicts. What an amazing piece of legislation. But of course, it had no enforcement mechanisms. It was largely symbolic. But just the fact that an American president would do such a thing is pretty remarkable. But that said, once again, it's a double-sided sword because he, just like his predecessors, he was involved in sending U.S. troops down into Latin America to protect corporate interests. And that's a big theme, and like I say, I'll be doing a video on that. And these Coolidge policies kind of moved into later years too, when FDR created the Good Neighbor policy of 1933, which once again was supposed to go against using war to propagate national interests and expand trade and everything else. But we also know that FDR was deeply involved in facilitating World War II. I know this shocks a lot of people about the narrative about being surprise attacked by Japan, but there was a lot of things that led up to that, including an oil embargo against Japan when they were spreading their empire against most of Asia. And we also know historically, and this is documented, that the United States did indeed know that Pearl Harbor is going to be attacked, and they essentially allowed it in order to expand military power. And of course, the whole idea behind that is the selling of arms and the transfer of wealth to the elites. And then another good example of that, what I was just talking about, is President Wilson, a Democrat from 1913 to 1921. He ran on a platform of not entering the European War that we now call World War I. And then a passenger ship, the Lusitania, it was a passenger ship, and it was loaded with arms. And Germany had warned that any ships shipping arms to Europe to support the war effort would be legitimate targets for its U-boats. And so the U.S. also um, put together a course for the Lusitania that would make sure it would be a target for German U-boats, and that was the catalyst for getting the U.S. involved in World War I, where we, of course, lost millions of soldiers. We entered the last year of the war, 1917. It was over in 1918, and in 1 year we lost millions of soldiers. But he ran on a platform. He got elected, and then he just changed his mind. Once again, serving the elites, and we've seen that before. The Vietnam War. First, it was a low-level war, and then advisors were moved in there, and then they wanted to up the game. So they created the fabricated Tonkin Gulf incident, where supposedly a U.S. ship was attacked by North Vietnam, and we used that for a catalyst to justify the complete invasion of Vietnam for the war against the North. And everybody knows the story about that. And if they don't, they should be informed. And if necessary, I will cover that at length in the future. So then President Hoover, a Republican, was president from 1929 to 1933. And he essentially avoided any entanglements and foreign interventions. But I'm sure, like a lot of these other presidents, he was involved in regional wars and proxy wars. But on this one point, I do not have the research. Then FDR, a Democrat, was president from 1933 to 1945. And of course, as I just mentioned, he got us into World War II. And tens of millions around the globe died as a result of that war. And we could argue about the moral high ground here, but that's a very complicated issue. For the purposes of this video, it's just something to be pointed out that certainly FDR was involved in one of the biggest wars we've ever seen, with the highest rates of casualties amongst the military and civilians. Then immediately following World War II, we have a Democrat. Harry Truman was president from 1945 to 1953, and he got us into the Korean War. And the Korean War, once again, resulted in millions of deaths on both sides and served the military-industrial complex. Then a Republican was voted back in, Eisenhower, from 1953 to 1961. And of course, he's there at the height of the Cold War, the post-World War II stalemate between the Soviet Union and the United States. And even though he gave a famous speech warning about the dangers of the military-industrial complex and giving an alert to what we now see as just commonplace activities of the United States government, in some ways it's a little disingenuous, because once again it just gets very complicated. He was involved in foreign affairs as well. And then we have a Democrat back in, John F. Kennedy, from 1961 and 1963. And a lot of people don't know that he was one of the first presidents to actually get us involved in Vietnam. And we got involved in Vietnam because after World War II, the Vietnamese had been fighting for their independence under Japanese occupation during World War II. And after the war was over, instead of gaining their liberation and their freedom like they wanted, France demanded they continue to be a colony like they were before the Japanese occupied it. And so we went in there basically to support the recolonization of Vietnam by the French, and then we ended up basically taking over for their war. And under Kennedy, we sent in advisors, and of course, advisors just cloaking the fact that we're sending military in there to start a new war. So there's a lot of great mythology, and President Kennedy is greatly admired, and I believe in a lot of the ideals, and believe that he potentially could have been a great president had he lived. But the fact is that he's the first president to get us involved in Vietnam. Then we had another Democrat elected, Lyndon Baines Johnson, from 1963 to 1969. Of course, he escalated the war even further in Vietnam, resulting in the slaughter of millions of people in both the North and South Vietnam. And once again, as always, massive arms shipments, massive destruction and then replacement of armaments, and massive transfer of wealth to the elites who are cashing in on the misery of the peasants. Then, of course, we had a Republican, Richard Nixon, elected in 1969 and in office to 1974, and he famously is the one that inherited the bloodbath in Vietnam. And so, once again, he escalated the war considerably and moved into illegal wars in both Cambodia and Laos. And then Henry Kissinger, his advisor, had even at one point even suggested dropping nuclear bombs on North Vietnam. So definitely a warmonger there. Then after Nixon resigned from office, we had Gerald Ford for 3 years, 1974 to 1977, and he did end the Vietnam War. And as far as I know, there weren't any other wars he was involved in, although I'm sure there was ongoing regional conflicts involving the U.S. So it's probably not an unbroken stream, but Gerald Ford decidedly was less of a warmonger. Then after Gerald Ford, another Democrat, Jimmy Carter, was in office from 77 to 81, and he didn't start any wars, although certainly there was the confrontation with Iran when the Shah of Iran was toppled and the Islamic government took over there. So Carter is actually somewhat of another bright spot. Then we have a Republican, Reagan, who between 1981 and 1989 was in office, and he was involved in global wars to a certain extent, in the proxy war with the Soviet Union. So he was president during the height of Cold War tensions, and he also was involved in continuing other proxy wars happening all over the world involved with the Cold War, but no gigantic wars under Reagan, and even though he was in office for such a long time. So I'll give a little bit of a hat tip to Reagan. And then after Reagan, Bush Sr., another Republican, was in office from 1989 to 1993. And of course, he was president during the trumped-up invasion of Panama, and then he was the one that instigated the first Iraq War, which once again resulted in the deaths of not that many Americans relatively, but certainly millions of Iraqis. And then he left it open-ended so that we could have another war in the future. And Bush Sr., of course, was a head of the CIA for a while, and some speculation that he was involved in the Kennedy assassination. And Bush Sr. has plenty of wars on his hands, and also, of course, is a big player in the oil industry and the protection, extraction, and confiscation of oil resources around the world are responsible for plenty of wars. Then after Bush Sr., we have Bill Clinton, another Democrat from 1993, 2001. And of course, he carried on a lot of these proxy wars, but he was involved in the so-called NATO war with the breakup of Yugoslavia. And so the U.S., under the umbrella of the UN, went in there, and once again, tens of thousands of people were killed, and a lot of that tension, a lot of those wars continue to this day. And then we have a Republican who voted in after that, the infamous George W. Bush, who of course finished his dad's work and went back into Iraq. Now we have a failed nation there, and we have, well, I don't even want to get into it. It's so complicated. It's such a quagmire. And we have regional wars all around that region that continue to involve what happened in Iraq. But, you know, as I'm driving at a lot of these presidents like George W. Bush and George Bush Sr. and people like Nixon and LBJ, a lot of them are war criminals. And that's just a simple fact. And Democrat Obama was elected from 2009 to 2017, and I know he's a huge icon for the liberal base, and he certainly is very charming, and he certainly is very personable, and he's young and full of vitality, and projects a very great image. But he's one of the worst of U.S. presidents as far as being a warmonger and serving the elites. Global arms sales reached huge new records under the Obama administration, and he was responsible for getting us into wars in Libya under the NATO umbrella. Now we have another failed state that continues to unleash violence and arm flows all over North Africa and the Middle East as a result of that. And once again, a topic too complicated to expand on too much here. Then after all these promises of not having boots on the ground in Syria and getting involved in the Syrian civil war, we come to find out all the conspiracy theories we heard were correct. And now here we are. Everybody forgets the promises of no boots on the ground in Syria, and now the U.S. empire occupies a third of Syrian territory and controls all the oil-rich regions, and then confiscates the oil and ships it out of the country. And then Obama oversaw the Yemen, the war with Saudi Arabia has had with Yemen, and that's been going on over a decade now and continues to go on. And then, God, I can't even read my own writing. Oh yeah, President Obama, actually Senator Obama, he created a new branch for all the global regions that U.S. has commands to facilitate war and supposedly protect democracy and all that horseshit. And Africa, Obama, his major piece of legislation during his tenure in Congress was to create AFRICOM. And over the last 20 years of the creation of AFRICOM, the U.S. military is involved in nearly every country in Africa. And of course, we go in there in the idea that we're going to go in there and train and facilitate the governments of all the different African countries to fight insurgents. And but the fact remains they're serving interests, American interests. They're serving the military industrial complex because we're also going in there and selling all these countries arms and serving the corporate elites and creating another continental slaughter. And as we well know, there's certain headlines that are around today that continue to show that all of that's still going on. We recently got the U.S. recently got kicked out of Niger, and there's talks about them being kicked out of Chad and Mali too. But there's pretty much a hot war in Somalia and all these other countries. Once again, I don't want to get into too much of that, but the idea that we just have advisors in there and we're arming them and training them, of course, is not exactly right, because inevitably U.S. bases are created there, U.S. troops are there, they're intrinsically involved in all these operations. And then we have, of course, President Trump. And I know about all the vitriol and all the hate on Trump, but he is one of the few presidents of the last 100 years to not get America involved in a war. So very, very commendable about him. But I have no illusions about Trump. I remember the first day and I did a video about this at the time, Trump's first day in office, he bombed Yemen. So he's not exactly, and we also know that he's a strongman kind of leader, and he's been very vocal and direct about the fact that he'd have no problem getting into any wars if they should occur. But I have to give him props because overall he's been pretty good about addressing getting America not involved in interventions and expanding global trade. And so I got to give him props for that. And he did attempt to get the U.S. out of Iraq unsuccessfully because of a lot of resistance from both Democrats and Republicans in the U.S. Congress, the Uniparty. And of course, they're serving their corporate masters in the military-industrial complex, so that they're not going to allow Trump to change that policy. And the worst example was Trump tried very hard to get the U.S. out of Afghanistan. And once again, Congress blocked it. They didn't want to cut off the cash cow of arms sales and the lucrative nature of the war. Of course, all of Congress is invested in the arms industry, so they're all making a lot of money off these wars, and they don't want to cut that off too. But the worst part about that was they wouldn't allow Trump to get the U.S. out of Afghanistan. But one of the first things when Biden, a Democrat, becomes president, he just unilaterally withdraws from Afghanistan, and a complete disaster the way he did it. But it's very apparent that the deep state, the military-industrial complex, and Congress just didn't want Trump to get the credit for it. So we ended up with another disaster. Now we have Afghanistan with one of the best equipped armies in the world now, with massive amounts of equipment left behind, and just a total clusterfuck. And to go on about Biden, you know, it's pretty obvious. So we had 4 years of no wars under Trump, and then when Biden gets in office, now we're in this war in Ukraine, which he is completely backing and shelling out hundreds of billions of dollars that should be invested in the United States for all the problems we have. But no, it's going to this failed state, this corrupt state, this state that can't possibly win in a war that was provoked by Ukraine. It wasn't provoked by Russia, which is of course, the statist narrative, this idea that we're defending democracy. There's nothing democratic about Ukraine. They have a corrupt government. They're funneling all these funds into their own bank accounts that we send there. They're sending out the peasant armies to be slaughtered in the field in a war that can never be won. And Zelensky's suspended elections. He's pursued his political opponents and jailed them. He's actually running out of peasants. So now he's scouring the globe and getting Western help in order to round up all the people that managed to escape Ukraine and bring them back and send them out to the fucking trenches to die like all the peasants throughout thousands of years of history. So there's nothing new there. And then we have this Gaza slaughter. Biden's giving all this lip service that he cares about the civilian populations, and he cares about all the horrifying things that are going on in Gaza, and backs Israel 100%. But then the words are meaningless. He keeps shipping the arms, as many as he can, and the worst kind of ordnance to Israel to slaughter more Gazans. And then he talks about, oh, we're not gonna give them certain weapons, and we don't want you to slaughter people in Rafah, and we want to have a ceasefire. That's all bullshit. Just like all these presidents, they just give lip service to that. They're 100% behind all these wars because they're all bloodthirsty warmongers. It's all about money, and all our leaders are all about money. All the generals are all about money. All the deep state is all about money. All the arms manufacturers and all the corporations are all about money. That's what it's all about: oil and money and power. And so this Gaza situation will continue to unfold. We have another impending war coming up under the Biden administration. I'm glad he can slip in one more war before he either gets ousted from the election or dies or becomes out of office in a few months. But there's going to be another war between Hezbollah and Israel very soon. So we'll have another war under his belt. And then let's not forget the Mac Daddy of them all. We're in a situation now where, because of what's going on in Ukraine, Biden is in charge of the nuclear arsenal, and we have the rhetoric and all the movements being escalated to the point where these things take on a life of their own. There could be a war of epic proportions, a global war unleashed that nobody wants. And that's what happened in World War I. Everybody was armed to the teeth with all this new modern technology. Nobody wanted this war. And all it took was the lighting of one match to unleash a horror beyond belief that happened during World War I. So anyway, I guess I could go on. I often do, but that's my wrap up. In 100 years of the last American history, nearly every single one of our presidents is a warmonger and serves as corporate master, serves the arms sales around the globe. You know, it's funny, they talk about gun control in the U.S. and then they flood the entire world with weapons so that everybody else's people can be slaughtered. So that kind of hypocrisy is not lost on me, and it would just seem like poetic justice if we end up having a nuclear war now. And one of the reasons why we might have a nuclear war is not because we're defending democracy or we have to beat that evil Putin. It's because of money, and it's because the economic system is on. You know, they tout how strong the economic system is. The economic system is loaded with debt. It's not sustainable. Everything's unraveling everything's unraveling in the economic foundation around the world. And then we have an election up. And it's almost to the point where I hate to even say this, and it's very hyperbolic, it's very doom laden, it's very fear mongery, all things I try to avoid. But would they actually blow up the entire fucking world just so Trump doesn't become president? I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.